It is the story of a man who was ostracized from a model community for not fitting in, and his quiet but determined journey to return, not for revenge, but to fundamentally change a community that has been ruled by fear. It is not just a fight between two people, but a confrontation between kindness and blind power, between silence and voice, between old and new. It is a story of justice, but not in a courtroom, but at the neighborhood gate. I used to think that only a court could evict someone from a place they called home. I was wrong. In Riverbend Estates, where the white picket fences are carefully painted, the pavers are precisely spaced, and the lavender is sprayed from automatic sprinklers every morning, the power lies not in the law, but in the hands of a group of people in the name of community standards. Specifically, a woman with a frozen smile and platinum blonde hair that never seemed out of place, Karen Whitmore, president of the HOA for 11 years straight. She wasn't just the voice of the neighborhood. She was the neighborhood. And I was something of an eyesore from the day I arrived. I was young, single, and had just taken my first teaching job at a nearby high school. The house I bought was the smallest in the neighborhood and older than the rest, but it was all I could afford on my teacher's salary. I planted some daisies in the yard, hung the small swing on the porch, and painted the front door olive green because it made me feel at peace. I didn't think such little details would be grounds for a warning, but the first letter of reprimand from the HOA arrived exactly a week after I moved in. They said the door color didn't conform to the traditional color scheme adopted by the 2012 ordinance. I'd never read about the ordinance, and despite trying to find it, the HOA's website archives led nowhere. I repainted the door white, just like the lifeless doors on either side. But it didn't stop there. They fined me for hanging laundry out in the backyard, even though no one could see it unless they used binoculars from the neighbor's second floor. They fined me for putting my trash out on the curb 10 minutes earlier than the designated time. They warned me about the volume of music coming from my house. Soft classical music played every afternoon from an old speaker. I tried to be patient. I paid my fines. I attended a few community meetings, made polite comments. But Karen's gaze was always cold, as if my presence were an unacceptable crack in the perfect facade she tried to maintain. I didn't fit the bill, not because of my behavior, but because my very existence annoyed her. I lived alone. I didn't drive an SUV. I didn't take my dog for a weekly grooming. I didn't have uniformed kids running around the backyard, and I didn't attend the wine candles sessions the Neighborhood Women's Association hosted every Friday. I wasn't part of Karen's script, and so she built an elaborate chain of administrative charges, step by step. Ultimately, the HOA voted to cancel my maintenance contract, cut off common services, and after several meetings to which I was not invited, they gave me an ultimatum. If I did not comply with the residential restandardization guidelines, they would take legal action based on a violation of the bylaws. I had no money for a lawyer. I had no allies. And most of all, I had lost the belief that I could live decently in a place that wanted me gone. I sold my house quietly, without a fight, without protest. I left like a shadow without leaving my name on the resident list. In Karen's eyes, that might have been a victory. But for me, it was the beginning of a silent promise that I would return not to stay, but to change the place from the ground up. It didn't take me long to realize that, in Riverbend Estates, no decision was made without Karen Whitmore's hand. She wasn't just the HOA president, she was the neighborhood's executive, ratifier, supervisor, and sometimes Supreme Court. On paper, the HOA was a democratic organization with voting board members and regular meetings. But in reality, everything revolves around Karen like the sun around her own orbit. From the choice of flowers to the exact time the streetlights should be turned on, everything goes through her. No one dares to object, not because they agree, but because objections have no place in the system she has so skillfully built over more than a decade. Karen has a unique way of ruling, no yelling, no overt threats. She commands with her eyes, with reminders as light as a feather but as heavy as a rock. A neighbor told me that last year, just because they put a flag of their favorite football team on their porch, the HOA ordered them to remove it within 24 hours. Violations of aesthetic integrity was Karen's favorite phrase, used to eliminate any sign of individuality, of difference, of anything that made the neighborhood less uniform than the glossy brochures she had designed and distributed to residents. No one had to sign off. Simply seeing deviation was enough to turn an innocuous detail into a serious problem. Karen's control didn't stop at the surface. She had an informal list of model resident behavior, and anyone who deviated from it was scrutinized. Single women were looked at with suspicion, long-term renters were tacitly discriminated against, and gay families were discouraged, though no regulation explicitly said so. Those who lived properly were favored, introduced to closed community groups, elected to school parent-teacher conferences, and even assisted by the HOA when filing home improvement applications. The rest, like me, were classified as complicated. Karen never yelled at me, but every HOA decision bore her cold stamp. Midterm rewrites of bylaws, sudden increases in administrative fines, unexpected changes in housing standards sent by mail without meeting minutes. When I asked about specific legal documents at a community meeting, a perfectly polite question, Karen simply nodded and suggested I file an official information request. The meeting ended with a "thank you for your concern," and I received a reminder letter for not following the pre-registered speaking order. What was most frightening was not Karen's power, but the way she made it seem normal. The residents got used to the arrangement. They learned to be silent, to laugh at injustice, to bow to a system they thought served them. Some began to imitate her, to make Karen a model for their own petty dreams of power in the shadows. And when people like me, like a few other families, those who refused to fit in, began to leave, Karen didn't need to say a word, because she knew that the order she had built was working exactly as it was designed, eliminating deviance naturally, like a body expelling alien debris. I left Riverbend Estates empty-handed, but with a valuable lesson in how power operates in the most seemingly civilized spaces. It took me years to stop feeling angry, and years more to understand that my departure was not a failure, but a temporary step back to get a better look at a rotten machine run by fake smiles and seemingly harmless regulations. I lived in a variety of places, taught and learned about real estate law and community governance, not because I wanted revenge, but because I didn't want to see anyone else forced out of the place they called home because they didn't fit the mold. That process inadvertently brought me back to the place that had pushed me out with warning letters and cold shoulders. Riverbend Estates was in transition. Karen was getting older. Her status was no longer sacrosanct, and many of the new residents, younger, more diverse, were beginning to question the unwritten norms that had been in place for more than a decade. I didn't return with the same humble exterior as the first time. I returned with experience, legal knowledge, and most of all a deep understanding that silence is never a neutral option in a gated community. The house I bought this time wasn't large, but it was centrally located right across from the park where the outdoor HOA meetings were held. I didn't paint my door olive, not because I was abandoning my identity, but because I didn't need to express my differences with color. What I brought with me this time was my voice, and it was stronger than any palette. At first, I thought I would just keep quiet and observe, but I soon realized that I was no longer alone in my thinking, most of whom had moved in within the past 5 years. started to approach me after brief conversations in the park or at school meetings. They heard me talk about homeowner rights, about the legal limits of HOA bylaws, about the difference between control and management, and they listened. Many had been wrongly fined for vague reasons, as I had been. They had never protested, simply because they had not known that they could protest. I didn't need to shout. I just told the truth, and that became the rallying cry. When rumors began to spread that I might be a candidate for the next HOA president, I responded calmly. Not because I didn't care, but because I knew it would happen sooner or later. Not because I wanted it, but because the community needed it. Riverbend has changed. It's no longer the monochromatic, stereotypical neighborhood it once was. People want a different voice, a different way of organizing, and they remember me, not because of my tumultuous past, but because I was a victim of the injustices they now feel permeate their lives. I don't have to fight to be accepted. They come to me as a friend who fell under the broken system they live under. I don't talk much about Karen or about my past as a neighborhood eviction, but perhaps that's what makes me more trustworthy, because I'm not back to overthrow anyone, but to change the way a community can live together, not through rigid rules, but through understanding and mutual respect. I wasn't the only one who felt stifled by Karen's rule, just the first to leave. In my absence, she continued to rule Riverbend Estates with a web of rules and microcontrols down to the odd tree planted in the wrong direction. But what she didn't foresee was that time would erode power like water, especially when the community was no longer as homogeneous as it had been in its early years. Young families began to move in. Some older residents sold their homes to be closer to their children or moved into nursing homes. Gradually, the once numeral residents, those who had bowed to Karen out of fear of conflict, were tired of the constant repetition of unreasonable rules and empty spoken meetings. The distaste didn't explode into an open revolt, but rather slowly seeped in. People began to abstain from voting at meetings. The number of residents who voted for council members dropped sharply. HOA emails received fewer responses. Small changes like allowing colored lights during the holidays or extending the hours of the children's play area were rejected by Karen in the name of maintaining order. But this time, the silence that followed was not a sign of agreement, but a sign of distrust. Karen didn't understand that what she held was no longer respect, but an outdated habit of submission. And when that habit is replaced by awareness, power is no longer a crown, but an empty shell. I sensed the shift every time someone knocked on my door and recounted unpleasant experiences they had once thought were personal. A young mother complained about her child being told not to use chalk on the concrete driveway. Karen called it vandalism. A single father was warned for leaving his child's bike parked in the garage for more than 2 hours. An elderly couple were told to replace their flower bed with less allergenic plants, something that had never been formally mandated. These little stories taken individually were just annoyances, but taken together, they created a picture of constriction, and more importantly, they began to evoke empathy between people who had never spoken to each other. Isolation. Karen's once effective weapon began to lose its effectiveness as the community began to find its voice. No one said outright that they wanted Karen gone, but the looks in their eyes at meetings, the sighs when a new resolution was read, the long silences after her pleas for stability, all were clear signals. They were tired of stability being synonymous with confinement, tired of being defined as a threat, tired of feeling like this place was no longer their home, but an endless repetition of taboos. I didn't have to convince them that Karen was irrelevant. They knew it. I was just a mirror reflecting a frustration they had no words for. And when the proposal for a more democratic election was put forward by a young new council member, not me, I knew the time had come. Not to overthrow a person, but to unlock a community. Not to destroy, just to change the bolt. I never had any ambitions for power, and certainly never imagined that my name would appear on the list of candidates for HOA President, a position that for more than a decade had been considered the exclusive domain of one irreplaceable person. But there were times when stepping up was no longer a personal choice, but a natural response to circumstances. I never announced my candidacy. There was no banner, no slogan, no campaign in the true sense of the word. But when the council sent out letters asking for self-nominations or community nominations, my name appeared on 7 applications, handwritten in different handwritings, by people I had only spoken to a few times, and some who had never even known that I had been an outcast in this neighborhood. I faced that decision in silence, without consulting anyone, without weighing the pros and cons. Just spending an evening alone with a cold cup of tea, rereading the old HOA bylaws, and noting the rules that had been abused to oppress residents. I didn't want to run for office simply to replace one face with another. I wanted to ask the fundamental question, who is an HOA for? To govern or to control? To connect or to exclude? And most of all, can a community be run on trust instead of fear? When I submitted my application, I didn't think of it as a declaration of war. I just thought of it as doing what needed to be done to end a cycle that had gone on for far too long. The first reaction came not from the community, but from Karen. She said nothing directly, but the following week residents' mailboxes received a double-thick notice detailing the essential qualities of a sustainable HOA leader, with a list of her personal accomplishments neatly woven into long paragraphs. The writing was cryptic, but it did nothing to disguise the underlying anxiety. She had never faced a real opponent. All her previous re-elections had been won with the apathy of the community and the absence of a challenger. But this time, she sensed something else. A quiet but certain breath of new air seeping through every porch. I didn't respond. I didn't write rebuttals. I didn't hold meetings. I went about my life as usual, teaching, watering plants, occasionally chatting with a neighbor about their child's education, or listening to an old person talk about old winters. I didn't project an image. I let people see me for who I was. And that's why my support came not from blind faith, but from experience. They didn't just want a new president. They wanted someone who listened, someone who had been pushed out, but who had come back and chosen not to retaliate. They wanted someone who represented the part of themselves they had lost in dry meetings and cold regulations. I know I will face many challenges. Karen will not let go easily. But this time I will not walk alone. I bring expectant glances, whispers of encouragement along the way, handshakes without commitment. I am not running to win. I am running to give this community a choice they have never had before. A choice not born of fear, but of the desire to be authentic, to be themselves, and to believe that justice sometimes begins with the smallest things. Like someone who was once dismissed, now standing up and walking into the room as a candidate. I've always believed that people who rule by fear don't know how to react when faced with an opponent who doesn't play by the same rules. Karen was that type of person. For years, she didn't need to convince anyone or defend her reputation, because her reputation was built not on respect, but on the weight of weaponized rules. She never asked for support, only for obedience. So when she realized that I wasn't a ghost who had returned to disappear, but a real candidate for HOA President, her response was not to talk, but to attack. But not publicly. She knew how doubt works. Sow it in the right place, at the right time, and let it spread like an oil slick. The rumors began to circulate, vague but deliberate, that I had been forced out by my former HOA for serious contract violations, that I was not financially stable enough to understand and manage the resident fund, that I had behavioral problems at my former job. None of them were substantiated, but that was what made them dangerous, because nothing sticks like an unverified whisper, especially when it comes from people who are used to being trusted because they've won so many times. Karen didn't say it directly, but several familiar faces on the HOA board, people who had been silent under her, began to mention concerns in small meetings. An anonymous letter was distributed in the resident mailbox, handwritten and unsigned, about a person who had disrupted the order of River Bend and was back to pick up the slack. I didn't argue. I didn't hold a protest meeting. I didn't send a letter. Instead, I kept quiet and kept showing up, not in campaigns, but in the daily life of the community. I picked up books at the little neighborhood library. I helped a neighbor fix a broken gate. I entered the annual apple pie cooking contest. No excuses, no lines of explanation. I let them see me, not through Karen's lens, but through their own experience. And strangely enough, my silence made her noise stand out. People began to notice the spiteful tone in the HOA's recent letters. They were annoyed by the board members' constant references to stability, tradition, protecting core values. Words that were used so often they were empty. And then at a special meeting, a young resident stood up, not me, and asked Karen directly if she could provide any concrete evidence to support the allegations that were circulating. She smiled wryly, changed the subject, and talked about vigilance. But then the necessary happened. She was forced to speak up, and as the light shone, the ambiguity became vulnerability. The rumors didn't disappear, but they lost their power. The skeptics began to feel offended rather than protected, because without evidence, the claims weren't just false, they were an insult to the community's intelligence. Karen didn't realize that, by sowing unfounded doubt, she had defined herself not as a guardian of order, but as someone so afraid of losing power that she would trade respect to retain her position. And in a place where power was once built on fear, letting people see fear in the eyes of those in power is the downfall. When Election Day arrived, the mood in River Bend Estates was different than usual. In the past, it had been a formality, a few ballots, a few familiar names, a predetermined outcome. But this time, people lined up at the temporary voting booth in the community hall. There were people voting for the first time since moving in, and old faces I had thought had given up on change. They didn't hold signs, they didn't shout slogans, but their eyes lit up quietly. It was as if they had all traveled a well-worn path that now, for the first time, had a turning. I got there neither early nor late, dressed modestly, no speech, no posing. I knew that at this point all words were superfluous. If I had to resort to last-minute persuasion, I had already lost. I just stood to one side, greeting a few acquaintances, shaking the hand of an old man who had told me about his time at the power plant, and smiling at a little girl helping her mother fill out a large, fat ballot. I didn't think about winning. I just hoped I wouldn't be alone, and even that I knew by then wasn't going to happen. The results were announced that afternoon, short and unpretentious. I had won the HOA presidency with nearly twice as many votes as Karen. There was no cheering, no trumpets, just an eerie silence, as if the community had just weathered a great wind and was now learning to breathe again. Karen didn't show up for the announcement. A former board member read a letter on her behalf, temporarily stepping down for health reasons and to make room for the next generation. No one applauded, no one was sad, no one was triumphant. We had crossed a line too far to hold on to such shallow emotions. I felt no gloating, No sense of triumph, as one might expect. I felt a strange peace, like paying a debt not for honor, but for the right thing to do. The seat Karen had held for more than a decade now sat empty at the table. I sat there, not as a replacement, but as the representative of a new beginning. I didn't promise to please everyone. I didn't want to turn Riverbend into a paradise. But I knew I wouldn't use my power to make anyone feel like they didn't belong. I knew how devastating that felt. I'd carried it in my heart for years. My first move was not to rewrite the bylaws, nor to stage a major reform. I simply called for small meetings in the park where people could talk without agendas or votes. I invited the quietest residents to speak, and I listened without taking notes. I allowed children to cray on the sidewalks as long as the rain washed them away, and I restored the porch where the swings had been banned, the little thing that had gotten me reprimanded in the early days. I didn't need anyone to remember me as chairman. I just wanted them to forget the fear that had crept into the reports and the citations. Sometimes justice comes not in applause, but in the restoration of normalcy. And to me, that was the clearest victory. Karen did not disappear immediately after the election. She still lived in the big house at the end of Magnolia Street, the house that had been a symbol of quiet power for more than a decade. The first mornings after my inauguration, I often saw her curtains slightly ajar, a silent figure standing behind the thick glass, watching the first small steps that the other residents and I were taking together. No one came to see her. People who had once flattered her, who had called her a pillar of the community, now avoided her eyes like something old that people no longer knew how to treat. Karen was no longer the Karen of years ago. In losing power, she lost her sense of self. In a community where the old order has just been dismantled, a power vacuum doesn't last long, but a psychological vacuum lasts longer. I didn't punish her, didn't mention her in any meetings. I didn't need to. She punished herself by trying to hold on to a structure that had collapsed. Rumors still swirled that Karen was preparing to file a complaint about the validity of the election, that she would use her old connections to overturn the results, that she would form a new, independent HOA for residents who wanted a return to original values. But all of that was just the echo of someone who refused to accept that her time was over. I thought she would quietly retreat, but she couldn't. A person who is identified with power for so long, when it's gone, doesn't know who she is without it. Karen began writing to the council at a regular pace, suggesting little things. Why had the flowers in the park been changed? Why were the bulletin boards no longer printed in the old format? Why weren't meetings required to be recorded? She signed her name clearly with the same proud, sturdy signature as before, but beneath the neatness was a panic of someone clinging to the last shreds of lost power. The climax came at an open meeting when she suddenly appeared after an absence of nearly 3 months. She did not sit down, did not wait for a formal statement, but stood in the middle of the room, her voice trembling but sharp, questioning me, not about anything in particular, but about myself. Do you think you are worthy? No one responded. No one stood up for her. I did not need to say anything. The silence of the room was the clearest answer. No one saw her as the voice of this community anymore. Without fear to feed, Karen's authority became superfluous. After that day, she closed her door for weeks. Some people said they saw her talking to herself on her afternoon walks, or standing for long periods of time in front of the neighborhood bulletin board, which now posted notices she no longer had the authority to approve. Others saw her angrily uprooting a newly planted flower bush near the sidewalk because it was not the right color. One resident called me, worried that she was showing signs of depression or a behavioral disorder. I wasn't happy about that. No one should have to compromise their identity to maintain a position. But no one should have to destroy a community to maintain personal power. Karen had done both. And now, the very thing she had used to exclude others, the isolation, the suspicious looks, the cold tone, were back, surrounding her. I don't hate her. The only feeling I had for her at that moment was regret, because sometimes the most tragic collapse is not the loss, but not realizing when you lost your true self. Karen lost her power, but what drove her crazy was not the failure, but the fact that no one cared about that failure anymore. And what about you? Will you continue to bow your head in silence? Or will you be the first to stand up and ask, how do we really want to live together?